They say dogs remember things people forget. In the high mountains of Montana, where winter arrives like a slow-moving wall of white, there is a German shepherd who has been standing in the same place for days, maybe longer, watching a lonely stretch of road that disappears into pine trees and drifting snow. The locals noticed him first when the storm rolled in late one afternoon, the kind of storm that swallows sound and turns the sky the color of cold steel. The wind came down the valley at nearly 30 miles an hour, lifting powdery snow from the ground and sending it spinning through the air like ghostly smoke. Most animals had already found shelter by then. Ranchers had brought their horses into barns. The few cars still traveling the mountain highway hurried toward town before the road iced over. But the dog did not move. He stood just off the shoulder of the narrow road, paws half buried in the snow, his thick sable coat collecting a thin crust of frost. His ears stayed upright, his amber eyes fixed on the empty road, as if he expected someone to appear at any moment. Every now and then he would lift his nose into the wind, breathing deeply, testing the air the way trained dogs do when they search for a scent carried miles across open land. A pickup driver passing through that evening slowed down when he saw the animal. He rolled down his window despite the bitter cold and called out once, a friendly whistle meant to coax the dog closer. The shepherd looked at him for a moment, calm and alert, but he did not approach. When the truck drove on, the dog simply returned his gaze to the road and waited again. The next morning the storm grew worse. Snow fell harder, thick flakes swirling through the forest and covering the highway in a pale blanket that erased yesterday's tire tracks. Visibility dropped to barely 100 yards. The kind of weather that convinces sensible creatures to stay inside beside warm fires and steaming coffee mugs. Yet by mid-morning the dog was still there, standing exactly where he had been the night before, his body rigid with patience. His breath rose in slow clouds against the gray air. Ranchers driving toward town began to talk about him over the radio, wondering whose dog he might be, wondering why he refused to leave. One woman said she had seen him earlier that week, before the snow started, sitting quietly beside the same road, as if guarding it. Another swore the shepherd had been there even longer than that, appearing every afternoon around sunset and disappearing again sometime after dark. No one could say for certain, but there was something unusual about the way he waited. Not restless, not afraid, just certain, as if somewhere beyond the falling snow, beyond the miles of empty road winding through pine and frozen hills, someone had once made a promise. And this dog had decided that promises were worth waiting for, no matter how long the winter lasted. By the second day of the storm the mountains had grown quieter than usual, the kind of silence that comes when snow falls thick enough to soften every sound. Pine branches bent under the weight of fresh powder, and the narrow two-lane road cutting through the valley had nearly vanished beneath several inches of white. A weathered wooden sign outside the small town of Gray Hollow read 27 degrees Fahrenheit that morning, though the wind made it feel much colder. Most people stayed inside their homes where heaters hummed steadily and the smell of coffee drifted through warm kitchens. Yet the German shepherd remained exactly where he had been, standing near the edge of the road with the same calm patience that had first caught everyone's attention. His paws had sunk deeper into the snow now, and a thin layer of frost clung to the fur along his back, but he did not seem frightened or confused. Instead, he watched the road with the quiet focus of an animal who believed that waiting had a purpose. Around mid-morning, a silver pickup slowed as it passed, its tires crunching overpacked snow. The driver was a rancher named Thomas Keller, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s who had lived in Gray Hollow most of his life. Thomas eased the truck to the shoulder and stepped out, pulling his wool jacket tight against the wind. He approached the shepherd slowly, speaking in the steady voice ranchers use with nervous horses and stray cattle. The dog turned his head toward him, eyes clear and intelligent, ears standing tall despite the cold. Thomas noticed immediately that this was not an ordinary stray. The animal's posture was disciplined, almost military in its stillness. The dog was lean but strong, built with the balanced frame of a trained working animal. A weathered leather collar circled his neck, darkened by snow and time. Thomas crouched carefully and brushed away the frost from the metal tag hanging beneath the collar. The engraving had faded slightly, but it was still readable. Atlas, United States Marine Corps K-9 Unit. Thomas let out a low breath that turned into mist in the cold air. That explained the calmness, the patience, the strange sense that the dog was not simply wandering, but carrying out a quiet mission no one else understood. Atlas stepped forward just once, lifting his nose toward the wind again, as if searching for a scent that refused to arrive. Then he returned to his post beside the road. Thomas studied the empty highway stretching through the valley, then glanced back at the dog. Snow drifted steadily across the asphalt, erasing the last tracks from the morning traffic. The rancher shook his head slowly. Whatever Atlas was waiting for had not come yet, but the shepherd's steady gaze suggested something powerful enough to hold him there against cold, hunger, and time. And in the silent mountains, with the storm growing heavier by the hour, the dog continued to watch the road, as though the next set of footsteps might appear at any moment. Thomas Keller remained beside the road for several quiet moments, studying the German shepherd with growing curiosity as the wind pushed thin sheets of snow across the valley. Atlas did not pace or whine the way most lost animals might. He simply stood with calm determination, eyes following the empty highway that curved between the dark pine trees and disappeared into the mountains. Thomas had seen working dogs before during his years running cattle, but there was something different about this one. The patience was deeper, steadier, like a soldier holding a post that no one else remembered. The rancher straightened slowly and looked again at the metal tag resting against the dog's chest. Atlas, United States Marine Corps K-9 unit. The words stirred an old memory somewhere in the back of his mind. A conversation he had overheard months earlier at the diner in town, where truckers and ranch hands gathered for hot coffee during cold mornings. Someone had mentioned a Marine who once trained dogs like this. A man who used to pass through Gray Hollow every summer on his way into the mountains. Thomas frowned slightly as the memory settled into place. The man had a tall frame and the quiet posture of someone used to discipline. He had come through town several times over the years with a German shepherd riding beside him in the passenger seat of a dusty pickup. The locals remembered the dog more than the man because the shepherd had always watched everything with sharp amber eyes, alert but calm, as though he understood the world better than most people. Thomas looked back at Atlas again and felt a slow recognition forming. The color of the coat, the steady gaze, even the shape of the ears seemed familiar now. This might be the same dog. If it was, then the animal was not lost at all. He was waiting. The rancher stepped closer once more, careful not to startle him. Atlas turned his head slightly, but did not step away. Snowflakes gathered along the ridge of his muzzle, melting slowly against the warmth of his breath. Thomas spoke quietly, more to himself than to the dog. He said that he remembered a Marine who used to drive this road every autumn before the first snowfall. The man would stop near this exact stretch of highway and walk a trail that climbed up toward the ridge overlooking the valley. Sometimes the dog ran ahead through the trees. Sometimes he stayed close beside the man, but they always returned before dark. Thomas had once asked the Marine why he liked this lonely road so much. The man had smiled in a tired but peaceful way and said that some places felt like home even when you had spent most of your life somewhere else. Atlas lifted his nose into the wind again, as if the name of that place still meant something. The rancher glanced down the empty road, the storm thickening once more, and he felt a strange certainty settle into his chest. If this truly was the same dog, then Atlas was not simply standing in the snow by chance. He was waiting in the exact spot where his human had once promised to return. The wind grew stronger as the afternoon faded toward evening, pushing long curtains of snow across the valley and softening the outlines of the distant hills. Thomas Keller stood beside the road for a while longer, watching the German shepherd and the silent highway stretching through the storm. The rancher finally pulled his wool hat lower against the cold and let out a slow breath that turned to mist in the air. He knew the mountains well enough to understand when weather was about to worsen. Another hour, and the road might disappear completely beneath drifting snow. Yet Atlas remained unmoved by the warning signs that every rancher and traveler in Montana learned to respect. The dog's attention never left the road. His ears shifted slightly whenever the wind carried a distant sound, and every few minutes he lifted his nose as if testing the air for a scent that refused to arrive. Thomas had seen stubborn animals before, but this felt different. This felt like faith. The rancher finally turned back toward his truck and opened the door, then hesitated. He reached behind the seat, and pulled out a small paper bag from the diner in town where he had stopped earlier that morning. Inside was a leftover breakfast biscuit wrapped in foil. Thomas walked back toward the shepherd and crouched slowly, placing the food gently on the snow a few feet away. Atlas glanced at the biscuit but did not move toward it. Instead, his eyes returned to the empty highway with the same quiet determination. Thomas gave a faint smile and shook his head. He said softly that the dog reminded him of the old Marines he had met decades earlier when a training unit passed through Montana during a summer exercise. Those men had carried the same calm patience, the same steady belief that a mission did not end simply because the weather turned bad. Atlas remained still, snow collecting along his back like a pale blanket. The rancher studied the dog for another moment and then looked again at the road curving through the valley. Somewhere beyond the drifting snow and the miles of frozen forest, there had once been a man who drove this road often enough to leave an impression on the town. A Marine who had spoken quietly and walked the mountain trails with a disciplined German shepherd at his side. Thomas could not remember the man's name yet, but he remembered the way the dog used to move beside him, alert and loyal in every step. The rancher finally climbed back into his pickup and started the engine. The heater hummed to life, filling the cab with warmth while snowflakes tapped softly against the windshield. Before pulling away, he looked once more through the glass at the shepherd standing alone beside the road. Atlas had not moved an inch. His gaze remained locked on the highway as though every second mattered. Thomas drove slowly back toward Gray Hollow, the tires crunching through fresh snow, but the image of the waiting dog stayed with him the entire way. And as the storm thickened across the valley, Atlas continued to stand at the edge of the road, watching the empty distance with the quiet certainty of an animal who believed that somewhere beyond the falling snow, the sound he was waiting for would eventually return. Morning arrived slowly over Gray Hollow, though the storm clouds never truly lifted. A pale light filtered through the thick sky, turning the snow across the valley into a quiet silver landscape that stretched for miles between the pine-covered ridges. The temperature had dropped overnight to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind moved steadily through the trees with a long hollow sound that echoed across the frozen hills. Atlas was still there when the first pickup truck passed along the highway shortly after sunrise. The German shepherd had not changed his position except for a few careful steps that shifted him slightly higher onto the roadside bank where the drifting snow had piled deeper. Frost dusted the fur along his back and shoulders, but his posture remained tall and alert. His amber eyes continued to follow the empty road with the same unwavering focus that had kept him standing there through the entire storm. In town, the story of the waiting dog had already begun to spread. Gray Hollow was the kind of place where news traveled quickly between the diner, the feed store, and the small gas station near the edge of town. By mid-morning, several people had heard Thomas Keller describe the shepherd standing alone in the snow with a United States Marine Corps tag hanging from his collar. A few remembered the Marine who had once driven through town during the warmer months, a quiet man who spoke politely and always kept his dog close at his side. One person thought the man had mentioned training work with military dogs years earlier. Another remembered seeing the shepherd leap easily into the bed of a pickup truck after a long hike through the mountains. None of them could remember exactly when the Marine had last come through Gray Hollow, but the memory of the pair walking together along the mountain trails lingered in the back of their minds like something unfinished. Late that morning, a woman named Dr. Emily Brooks heard the story while warming her hands around a cup of coffee inside the diner. Emily ran the small veterinary clinic on the far side of town, and years of caring for animals had taught her to listen carefully whenever someone mentioned a dog in trouble. She stepped outside into the cold after finishing her coffee, pulling her heavy coat tight as the wind moved across the parking lot. The road leading out of town toward the mountains was already half covered in snow, but Emily started her Jeep without hesitation. The engine rumbled to life, and within minutes she was driving slowly through the drifting snow toward the stretch of highway Thomas had described. Nearly 20 minutes later, the trees began to thin along the valley road, and Emily spotted a lone figure standing against the pale landscape ahead. The German shepherd was exactly where Thomas had said he would be. Atlas stood beside the quiet highway with his gaze fixed down the long empty road, as if every passing second mattered. When the Jeep approached, the dog turned his head slightly, but did not run or bark. He simply watched the vehicle with calm, steady eyes. Emily slowed the Jeep and stepped out into the cold air. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached the shepherd carefully. The wind lifted a few loose strands of fur along the dog's back, but Atlas did not retreat. Instead, he looked past her toward the distant curve of the road, disappearing into the storm, as though the person he was waiting for might appear there at any moment. Emily Brooks stood quietly a few yards from the German shepherd, allowing the cold mountain wind to move between them without rushing the moment. Years of working with frightened animals had taught her that patience often spoke louder than words. Atlas watched her for a moment, his amber eyes calm but distant, then slowly turned his gaze back toward the empty highway, as if the road itself mattered more than anything standing beside him. Emily noticed the details immediately. The dog was strong but tired, his thick coat dusted with frost from hours in the snow. His paws were planted firmly despite the cold ground, and the muscles along his shoulders carried the steady tension of a trained working dog who still believed he had a job to finish. She stepped closer, moving slowly enough that the snow beneath her boots made only a soft crunch. Atlas did not back away. Instead, he lifted his nose into the wind again, breathing deeply as if testing the air for something that had not yet arrived. Emily crouched slightly and studied the leather collar resting against his neck. The metal tag hanging beneath it swung gently in the wind. She brushed a thin layer of frost away with her gloved fingers and read the engraving. Atlas, United States Marine Corps K-9 Unit. The words confirmed what the townspeople had already suspected. This dog had once belonged to someone who trained animals for discipline and purpose. Emily looked up at the shepherd again and felt a quiet respect settle in her chest. Dogs like this were not ordinary companions. They were partners to the people who trained them, animals who learned to listen for commands even when the world around them grew chaotic or uncertain. She spoke softly, her voice calm and warm despite the cold air. She told the dog that the storm was not going to end soon, and that standing here alone would not make the road clearer. Atlas listened but did not move. His ears shifted slightly at the sound of her voice, but his eyes returned to the distant curve of the highway disappearing through the snow. Emily followed his gaze down the long, empty stretch of road and wondered who he expected to see. The valley remained silent except for the wind moving through the pine trees. No vehicles approached. No footsteps appeared in the distance. The storm clouds hung low over the mountains, turning the afternoon light pale and quiet. Emily stood slowly and glanced back toward her Jeep parked along the roadside. She opened the back door and reached inside, pulling out a thick wool blanket that she kept in the vehicle during winter calls. When she approached again, she laid the blanket gently across the snow a few feet from the dog. Atlas glanced at it briefly, but did not step forward. His focus remained fixed on the empty road ahead. Emily sighed softly, realizing that whatever promise held the shepherd here was stronger than cold, hunger, or comfort. She stepped back toward the Jeep and watched him for another moment. Atlas stood exactly where he had been since the storm began, his breath rising in slow clouds as the wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth across the valley. And in the quiet Montana mountains, beneath a sky heavy with snow, the patient German shepherd continued to watch the road as though the sound he was waiting for might appear at any moment. Emily Brooks remained beside her Jeep for several quiet moments, watching the German shepherd as the wind continued to move across the valley. Atlas stood as steady as a carved statue, his body calm but alert, his eyes never leaving the long, white road stretching into the distance. Snow drifted across the asphalt in thin waves, and the sky above the mountains had taken on the pale gray color that often meant another storm band was forming beyond the ridge. Emily had seen stubborn animals before, but this was something else entirely. There was a discipline in the dog's posture that felt almost human, the kind of patience that came from training, loyalty, and something deeper that could not easily be explained. She stepped closer again, speaking gently as she might speak to a tired horse or a frightened rescue animal. Her voice carried warmth despite the cold air, and for a moment Atlas turned his head toward her. His ears shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence, yet the focus in his eyes remained tied to the empty road behind her. Emily followed that gaze again and felt a quiet understanding begin to form. This dog was not confused. He was not wandering. He was waiting exactly where he believed he needed to be. The veterinarian looked back toward her Jeep and opened the rear door once more. From inside, she took a small stainless steel bowl and a thermos of warm water that she kept for long winter drives. She walked back toward the dog and placed the bowl carefully on the snow before pouring the water into it. Steam rose faintly into the cold air. Atlas glanced down briefly, then looked back toward the road. Emily smiled faintly at the quiet determination in that small gesture. She crouched slowly and spoke again, telling the dog that the valley would be colder after sunset and that no one would blame him for resting somewhere warmer. Atlas remained silent, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The wind carried the scent of pine trees and distant wood smoke from town, but the dog seemed to listen for something else entirely. Minutes passed in stillness. Then, for the first time since Emily arrived, Atlas shifted his weight slightly and lifted his nose high into the air. His ears stood taller, his body tightening with sudden focus. Emily noticed the change immediately. Animals often sense things long before people did, subtle sounds or distant scents carried across miles of open land. She turned and looked down the road again, but at first she saw nothing except the endless white curve disappearing between the trees. The wind continued to blow snow across the highway in quiet sheets. Atlas took a single step forward toward the road, his eyes sharp with attention. Emily felt a small ripple of curiosity and hope pass through her chest. Somewhere far beyond the bend in the road, something had stirred the dog's senses. The mountains remained silent, but Atlas stood watching the distant horizon with renewed intensity, as though a long-awaited sign had finally appeared somewhere beyond the falling snow. Atlas stood motionless beside the road, every muscle in his body drawn tight with attention as the wind moved across the valley. His ears remained high and forward, his nose lifted slightly as though a faint thread of scent had reached him through the snow-filled air. Emily Brooks watched the change carefully. Animals rarely reacted like that without reason. Something had shifted, something subtle but real enough for the dog to notice. The veterinarian stepped closer, her boots pressing softly into the powdery snow. She followed Atlas's gaze down the empty highway that curved gently through the pines before disappearing beyond a low ridge nearly half a mile away. At first the road remained silent. The wind pushed loose snow across the asphalt, and the distant trees swayed quietly beneath the weight of the storm. Emily could hear nothing except the steady whistle of the wind. But Atlas did not relax. He took another step forward, his paws crunching lightly against the frozen ground. His tail remained still, his posture alert yet controlled, like a trained soldier waiting for confirmation of something he already believed to be true. Emily folded her arms against the cold and watched with growing curiosity. The moment stretched on for nearly a minute before she noticed it too. At the far edge of the valley, beyond the curve of the road, a faint shape moved between the drifting snow. At first it looked like nothing more than a shifting shadow against the pale landscape. Then slowly the outline became clearer. A vehicle was approaching, moving carefully through the storm at a steady pace. The sound of the engine had not yet reached them, but Atlas had sensed it long before human ears could hear anything. The German shepherd stood taller now, his breath rising in small clouds as he stared toward the distant truck. Emily felt a quiet chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. She had never seen a dog wait with such focused certainty. The vehicle continued slowly along the highway, its dark shape becoming more visible with each passing moment as it navigated the snow-covered road. The storm softened the edges of everything, but the movement was unmistakable now. Atlas stepped forward again until he stood only a few feet from the edge of the highway. Emily did not try to stop him. She sensed that this moment belonged to the dog, that whatever story had brought Atlas to this lonely road was beginning to move again after a long silence. The approaching truck rounded the bend nearly half a mile away, its headlights glowing faintly through the falling snow. Atlas watched with unwavering focus, his entire body quiet except for the slow rhythm of his breathing. The wind carried the scent of gasoline and warm metal across the valley. Somewhere deep in the dog's memory that scent meant something important. And as the truck continued slowly down the mountain road, Atlas remained standing at the roadside, waiting with the calm belief that the long, empty road might finally be bringing someone home. The truck continued down the narrow mountain highway, its tires moving slowly through the thin layer of packed snow as the storm drifted quietly across the valley. From a distance the vehicle appeared little more then a dark shape against the pale landscape, but with every passing second it grew clearer against the white road. Atlas stood perfectly still beside the shoulder, his body aligned toward the approaching vehicle with the calm focus of a trained sentinel. His ears remained forward, his nose lifting again into the wind, as if each breath carried a message that only he could understand. Emily Brooks watched both the dog and the distant truck with a quiet sense of wonder. She had seen animals recognize familiar scents before, but rarely from such a distance. Whatever Atlas had detected had reached him long before the truck became visible through the falling snow. The veterinarian stepped a few feet back, allowing the dog space while the moment unfolded. The vehicle continued its careful descent through the valley, its headlights glowing faintly through the drifting snow. As it moved closer, the shape of the truck became clearer, a dark green pickup with a thin layer of frost gathering along the hood and windshield. The engine sound slowly reached them, low and steady beneath the whispering wind. Atlas shifted his weight again and took several deliberate steps closer to the road. His tail remained low and still, his posture composed but charged with quiet anticipation. Emily noticed the subtle change in the dog's breathing, slightly faster now, as though something deep in his memory had awakened after a long silence. The truck slowed further as it approached the bend in the road. Perhaps the driver had noticed the Jeep parked on the shoulder or the large German Shepherd standing beside the highway. The vehicle eased around the curve, its tires crunching gently over the frozen asphalt. Atlas remained focused on the driver's side of the truck, his amber eyes bright with concentration. Emily followed his gaze carefully, trying to see what the dog might already know. The truck rolled closer until it was less than 100 yards away. Snowflakes swirled through the headlights, catching the light like tiny sparks against the gray sky. Atlas stepped forward again until his paws reached the edge of the road. For the first time since Emily arrived, he let out a low sound in his throat, not a bark, but something quieter, almost like a breath of recognition. The pickup slowed to a near stop as it approached the waiting dog. The driver inside had clearly seen him now. The engine idled softly while the vehicle rolled the final few yards across the snow-covered road. Emily stood still beside her Jeep, her breath visible in the cold air as she watched the strange moment unfold. Atlas did not move toward the truck yet. He stood where he was, studying the driver's side window with an intensity that made the entire valley feel quiet around them. The storm continued to drift across the mountains, but in that small stretch of highway time seemed to pause. The truck came to a gentle stop beside the roadside, and Atlas remained standing in the snow, his eyes fixed on the driver as though the answer to years of waiting might be sitting just beyond that frosted glass. The engine of the truck idled softly in the cold mountain air while snow drifted across the windshield and settled along the edges of the hood. Atlas remained standing at the roadside, his body perfectly still except for the slow rise and fall of his breath. The German Shepherd's eyes were locked on the driver's window, as though the answer to a long unanswered question sat just beyond the thin layer of frosted glass. Emily Brooks stood quietly beside her Jeep, her boots planted in the snow while the wind brushed against her coat. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath with her. Inside the truck, the driver had clearly noticed the dog. The figure behind the wheel leaned slightly forward, studying the large shepherd standing calmly in the road. For a moment, nothing happened. The storm moved around them, the wind whispering through the pines and carrying small waves of snow across the highway. Then slowly the driver's door opened with a quiet creak. A man stepped down from the truck with careful movement, one hand steadying himself against the door frame. He wore a dark green jacket dusted with snow, the kind of heavy field jacket often worn by people who spend long hours outdoors in winter. Atlas did not bark or run forward. Instead, he stood where he was, watching the man with the same deep concentration that had kept him beside the road for days. The man closed the truck door and took a few slow steps forward into the drifting snow. His boots pressed softly into the powder as he moved toward the dog. There was a slight stiffness in his walk, the kind that comes from old injuries or long years of hard work, but his posture remained steady. When he was about 20 feet away, he stopped and looked directly at the German Shepherd. For a long moment, the two simply watched each other across the narrow strip of snow-covered road. Emily could not hear their breathing from where she stood, but she could feel the quiet weight of the moment. Atlas lifted his nose again, drawing a deep breath of the cold mountain air. The scent he had followed across miles of winter seemed to settle into certainty. His ears shifted forward and a low sound escaped his chest, not loud enough to echo across the valley, but clear enough to carry meaning. The man standing in the road froze when he heard it. His shoulders stiffened slightly as though something deep inside his memory had just awakened. He took another step forward, slower this time, studying the dog carefully. Snowflakes drifted between them, catching the pale light of the gray sky. Atlas finally moved. One careful step forward, then another. His tail remained low but steady, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Emily watched the distance between them close slowly until only a few yards remained. The storm continued to whisper across the mountains, but in that small stretch of road the world had grown quiet. Atlas stood just a few feet away from the man now, his breath rising in small clouds as he searched the familiar scent one more time. And in the silent Montana valley, the long wait that had held him beside the road through storm and cold seemed to reach the edge of its answer. For several seconds neither the man nor the dog moved. Snow drifted quietly through the space between them, soft flakes settling against Atlas's dark coat and the shoulders of the man standing in the road. The German shepherd's eyes remained locked on the man's face with unwavering focus, searching for something deeper than sight alone. Then the man spoke, his voice low and rough with disbelief carried on the cold air. He said the name slowly, as though he was afraid the moment might disappear if he spoke too loudly. Atlas. The sound of that single word seemed to move through the dog like a spark. Atlas's ears lifted higher, and his tail gave the faintest motion, not wild or frantic, but steady and certain. He took another step forward and lifted his nose toward the man's chest, breathing deeply as though confirming what his instincts had already told him. The man dropped slowly to one knee in the snow despite the cold ground beneath him. His movements carried a stiffness that hinted at long months of recovery and hard effort, yet his eyes never left the dog in front of him. When Atlas finally closed the last few feet between them, the dog stopped again, standing directly before him. For a moment, the German shepherd simply studied the man's face. His amber eyes searching through the changes time had written there. Snowflakes rested on the dog's muzzle and whiskers while his breath rose in soft clouds between them. The man reached out slowly with a gloved hand and placed it gently against the side of Atlas's neck. The moment his fingers touched the familiar fur, something shifted inside the dog. Atlas pressed forward suddenly, his calm discipline breaking at last into pure recognition. He leaned into the man's chest with a deep sound that carried years of waiting within it. The man wrapped both arms around the dog's shoulders, pulling him close despite the cold snow soaking through his clothes. For several long seconds neither of them moved. The storm continued around them, wind brushing across the valley and pine trees whispering along the hillsides. But the small circle of snow around the kneeling man and the German shepherd felt almost still. Emily Brooks watched from beside her Jeep, her breath visible in the cold air as she witnessed the reunion unfold. She could see the man's shoulders trembling slightly as he held the dog close, his hand resting firmly against Atlas's thick fur as though he was afraid to let go. Atlas stood pressed against him, his tail now moving slowly back and forth in quiet relief. The long road behind them remained empty, but the waiting that had filled it for so many days had finally ended. After a moment the man leaned back slightly and looked into the dog's eyes again, his voice softer now but steady with emotion. He said that he had tried to come back sooner. He said the mountains had been a promise he never forgot. Atlas listened as though every word mattered. And there in the middle of a silent Montana snowstorm, the loyal German shepherd who had stood watch beside the road through cold wind and endless waiting finally stood once more beside the man he had never stopped believing would return. The man remained kneeling in the snow with one arm wrapped around Atlas's shoulders, his hand resting against the familiar ridge of fur along the dog's neck, as though confirming that the moment was real. The storm continued to move quietly through the valley, wind sweeping thin ribbons of snow across the road, while pine branches swayed along the hillsides. For the first time since Emily Brooks had arrived, Atlas no longer looked down the empty highway. His attention had shifted completely to the man beside him. The German shepherd stood close, his body pressed gently against the man's chest, breathing slowly as though the long tension that had held him beside the road had finally begun to release. The man leaned back slightly and studied the dog's face again, his eyes soft with recognition. Years had passed since he had last seen the mountains of Montana, yet the dog standing before him looked almost exactly as he remembered. Atlas's coat still carried the same deep sable colors, his amber eyes still sharp and intelligent beneath the drifting snow. The man spoke quietly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of time. He said that the last time they had walked these mountains together the air had smelled of pine and summer rain rather than winter wind. He said that he had promised the dog they would come back one day, even if the road took longer than expected. Atlas listened without moving, the calm discipline of a trained canine still present in the way he held himself. Emily stepped closer across the snow, careful not to interrupt the moment too suddenly. When the man finally looked up and noticed her standing beside the road, he gave a small nod of gratitude, the kind strangers exchange when they both understand they have witnessed something important. Emily introduced herself quietly and explained that the town had noticed the dog standing beside the road through the storm. She said that Atlas had refused to leave the spot no matter how cold the weather became. The man listened and glanced back down at the shepherd beside him, a faint smile touching his face despite the cold air. He said that stubborn patience had always been part of Atlas's training. The dog had once waited hours during field exercises without moving, holding position until he heard the command that told him the mission was complete. Emily asked the man his name, and he answered after a short pause. Daniel Carter. The name settled into the quiet mountain air as though it had always belonged there. Emily recognized it immediately from the tag she had read earlier. The Marine who had once passed through Gray Hollow with a German shepherd riding beside him in a dusty pickup truck had finally returned. Daniel slowly rose to his feet, one hand resting against Atlas's shoulder for balance as he stood. The dog stayed close beside him, his tail moving slowly now, no longer stiff with uncertainty, but relaxed in quiet relief. Daniel brushed snow from his jacket and glanced once more down the empty road that had carried him back through the valley. The storm still drifted across the mountains, but the long wait that had held Atlas beside the roadside had finally come to an end. And in the quiet Montana valley, beneath the pale winter sky, the Marine and his loyal dog stood together once more as though the years between them had never truly broken the promise that brought them back to the same road. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the snow-covered road with one hand resting on Atlas's shoulder while the storm drifted gently across the valley. The wind had softened now, moving through the pine trees with a low whisper that carried the scent of frozen earth and distant wood smoke from Gray Hollow. For the first time since Emily Brooks had arrived, the German shepherd no longer watched the road behind them. Atlas stood calmly at Daniel's side, his body relaxed in a way that had not been possible during the long days of waiting. His tail moved slowly through the cold air, brushing lightly against the snow as if the tension he had carried beside the highway had finally lifted. Daniel looked out across the valley for a moment, his eyes following the road that wound between the mountains and disappeared beyond the ridge. He spoke quietly, more to Atlas than to anyone else, saying that some promises take longer to keep than people expect. The mountains had been far away for a long time, and the road back had not been simple, but the promise had remained the same. Atlas listened to the sound of Daniel's voice with the calm attention of a trained partner who understood that tone even after years apart. Emily stood a short distance away beside her jeep, watching the two figures framed against the pale winter landscape. She had spent her career helping injured animals and lost pets find their way home, but she had rarely witnessed loyalty that carried such quiet patience. Atlas had stood beside this lonely stretch of highway through cold wind and falling snow because something inside him believed the road would bring Daniel back. And somehow it had. Daniel turned back toward the truck and opened the passenger side door. Atlas stepped forward immediately and jumped into the seat with the easy motion of a dog who had ridden beside that man countless times before. The familiar movement made Daniel smile faintly as he brushed snow from the dashboard. Emily walked closer and wished them both a safe drive back to town. Daniel thanked her for looking out for Atlas while the storm passed through the valley. The engine started again with a low, steady rumble that echoed softly across the snow-covered hills. As the truck slowly pulled back onto the road, Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, his amber eyes calm and steady while he watched the mountains through the windshield. The highway stretched forward through the quiet valley, the the storm already beginning to fade into lighter snowfall, drifting across the distant trees. Emily remained standing beside her Jeep long after the truck disappeared around the bend. The wind moved softly through the pines, and the empty roadside where Atlas had waited for days slowly returned to silence. Yet something in the valley felt different now. The long vigil had ended, and the promise that held the dog beside the road had finally been fulfilled. In the quiet mountains of Montana, where winter storms often bury old footprints beneath fresh snow, one simple truth had proven stronger than cold wind or passing years. Loyalty does not measure time the way people do. It remembers the road, it remembers the voice, and when the moment finally arrives, it is always ready to walk home.